The Battle of Coral Sea was the first time aircraft carriers fought one another, and the battle was quite disastrous for both sides. Both sides lost an aircraft carrier, both sides suffered an aircraft carrier damaged, both sides lost a large quantity of aircraft, and both sides lost a couple of support ships. The two damaged carriers, Shokaku and Yorktown, were both expected to participate in their upcoming Navy's operations around Midway Atoll, which would result in the Battle of Midway. What's well known at this point in time is that Shokaku, along with Shōkakū, would not participate in the Battle of Midway, while Yorktown would go on to be repaired and participate. Today we are going to look at why the Japanese withheld Shokaku and Shōkakū from the fight, while the United States managed to get Yorktown back in. Between 9:07 and 9:40 a.m. on the 8th of May, 1942, Shokaku was struck by a total of 3 bombs. 2 dropped from Yorktown planes, and 1 dropped from a Lexington plane. One of the bombs dropped from Yorktown's planes exploded along the port bow of the ship, just under the forward edge of the flight deck. The bomb resulted in a large, intense fire breaking out on the bow of the ship, and though damage control took several hours to extinguish the fire, they did quickly contain it, so it did not spread further aft on the ship. Ultimately, this is the hit that would prevent Shokaku from making a timely recovery, and thus removing it from the upcoming MI operation. The forward edge of the flight deck was partially shredded and bent upwards, the number 1 elevator partially collapsed and got jammed, the anchor deck had buckled and partially collapsed, and the forward port hull was so badly torn that when Shokaku was moving forward, water was seeping into the hull and causing flooding. The other bomb dropped by Yorktown's planes pierced the flight deck aft of Elevator 3 and exploded on the boat deck. A few of the ship's launches were damaged, a small fire started, which was quickly contained and extinguished, and the number 11 triple 25mm machine gun mount was destroyed, and all of its operators were killed. The bulkhead aft of the upper hangar suffered extensive splinter damage, but overall the damage from this bomb hit was minor. The third and final bomb hit dropped from Lexington's aircraft struck the ship on the flight deck just aft of the island. The bomb exited the ship and exploded alongside the starboard hull. One of the legs to the primary signal mast was severed. Both of the Type 94 high-angle fire control directors were damaged. 2 25mm machine gun mounts were damaged, and their fire control director was annihilated. Hull plating along the starboard upper hangar was indented and scorched. As a result of these hits, Shokaku was ordered to fall back, and eventually it would make course for Japan in order to get repaired, and on the way to Japan it was hunted by no less than 8 U.S. submarines. Shōkakū remained on the battlefield and would recover the strike wave aircraft for both Shokaku and Shōkakū, upon which only 35 aircraft recovered were serviceable for the future, and on the 14th of May 1942, Carrier Division 5 reported that its aircrews would not be available for the Midway operation. On the evening of the 17th of May 1942, Shokaku finally arrived back at Japan and was within the safety of Kure. The damage was examined by shipyard personnel, and plans for its repairs were drawn up, and Isoroku Yamamoto visited the ship. After viewing the damage, Yamamoto would praise the crew for their efforts during the battle, and for bringing the ship back to Japan safely. As for the damage, repairs could not begin until the 16th of June, when a dry dock of sufficient size became available. Of course, by then, the Battle of Midway had already concluded. As for the undamaged Shōkakū, having 35 aircraft on board between the two ships was a disastrous number, and there were no available planes to transfer to Shōkakū, so it was decided that those planes would be dispersed amongst the carriers that would be going into the MI operation. While Shokaku was being repaired, Shōkakū sat with its hangars empty until aircraft were made available for the ship and new pilots were assigned. After being in dry dock for a mere 2 weeks, Shokaku was refloated on the 27th of June and took part in trials, having been fully repaired. Though the Battle of Midway ended up being quite the loss for the Japanese, as far as their count was concerned, they had already sunk at least 3 of the US's carriers and potentially a 4th. By their count, at the Battle of Coral Sea, both Lexington and Yorktown were sunk, and at the Battle of Midway, their aircraft supposedly sank 1 aircraft carrier, while a submarine got another. But of course, As we all know, Yorktown survived Coral Sea, and it was attacked by both aircraft and a submarine at Midway, while Enterprise and Hornet were undamaged. At roughly 11:25 a.m. on the 8th of May, 1942, 14 planes from Shōkakū and 2 from Shokaku broke off their attacks on Lexington and made course for Yorktown. This was the beginning of an intense attack, as Yorktown began maneuvering to avoid torpedoes, and bombs began landing in the water against the hull, which sent shrapnel up, piercing the hull, and also caused several indentations. Luckily, the ship remained watertight. Luck would run out at 11:27 as a single 250-kilogram or 550-pound bomb made its mark 23 feet ahead of the number 2 elevator and 15 feet inboard from the island. It would pierce 5 decks before detonating within an aviation storeroom. The explosion of the bomb would cause damage to bulkheads of varying degrees over roughly 116 feet of the ship's overall length. Smoke began pouring out of the flight deck as a fire raged, and damage control got to work. Deep in the bowels of the ship, boilers 8 and 9 suffered a flare from the concussion, and smoke filled the compartments, resulting in the belief that a fire had broken out in the boiler rooms. As a result, boilers 7, 8, and 9 were all shut down. The boiler rooms were temporarily abandoned until damage control could get in and assess the situation, and when it was recognized a fire had not broken out, the boilers were restarted within 30 minutes. A couple of minutes after the bomb pierced the flight deck, 2 more bombs would explode off Yorktown's port stern, which would open seams along the hull, and the ship began leaking oil. Yorktown would remain in the area and would go on to recover its attack wave between 12:30 and 1300. Rear Admiral Fletcher then contemplated whether Yorktown should carry out an attack against the undamaged Shōkakū on its own or not, since Yorktown had only recovered 26 serviceable aircraft and it only had 7 torpedoes left for an attack. It was eventually decided that Yorktown could not carry out an attack, and it would also recover Lexington's remaining aircraft. At 14:43, a series of devastating internal explosions rocked Lexington, and Yorktown would recover the remaining 23 aircraft from Lexington. Yorktown would remain in the Coral Sea on patrol until the next day, when Task Force 17 finally retired to Tongatabu on the 15th of May. On the 19th of May, after being refueled, Yorktown departed Tongatabu en route for Hawaii. On the 27th of May, the Japanese attack force for Operation MI departed Japan, while that same day at 13:52, Yorktown arrived at Pearl Harbor for the first time in 101 days. On the evening of the 27th, Yorktown was moored at berth 16, and emergency repairs began, and at 7:20 the next morning, Yorktown was moved into the number 1 dry dock, where it would be pumped out and permanent repairs could commence. Permanent repairs were estimated to take roughly 90 days. But that very day, Admiral Nimitz visited the ship and inspected the damage, and then he said, "We must have this ship back in 3 days." As far as Nimitz had been informed, in theory, emergency repairs could be completed within 4 days, and as far as Yorktown's Grey Book was concerned, the ship could commence operations once again on the evening of the 29th. Areas that had been demolished through the bomb's explosion had substitute materials put in their place of equivalent weight, strength, and mold. This would allow the ship's temporary patchwork over the holes to carry out extensive service. Damaged portions of bulkheads were cut away, and in their place, new framing and stanchions were installed. Along the ship's lower hull, from where bombs exploded in the water, it was found that the framing and flooring was all intact. Areas of the outer shell that had seams open up from the bombs exploding, causing splintering and concussion, were either caulked up or welded shut. To make up for aircraft and pilot losses suffered at Coral Sea, planes from Lexington and Saratoga were both transferred to Yorktown. Personnel to op these aircraft also came from both of those ships, but a handful were also new recruits. On the 28th of May, Task Force 16 consisted of Enterprise and Hornet departed Pearl Harbor, and on the evening of the 29th, Yorktown was undocked. During the early hours of the 30th of May, Admiral Nimitz once again visited Yorktown and had a conversation with Captain Buckmaster, though the exact details of this conversation have not been recorded. A few hours after Nimitz departed Yorktown, it, being flagship of Task Force 17, departed Pearl Harbor en route for Midway. On the 4th of June 1942, Yorktown was attacked by Japanese aircraft, which assumed that Yorktown was still sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea, so they believed they were attacking another U.S. aircraft carrier, which they believed they sank in that attack, and then when a second wave of Japanese aircraft returned, they found what appeared to be an undamaged carrier, but it was actually the patched Yorktown once again, so they assumed that they were attacking a different carrier from the one previously, and they damaged it. The supposedly sunk twice Yorktown was severely damaged, but it remained afloat until I-168 found it and torpedoed it twice, resulting in the ship finally sinking at 5 a.m. on the 7th of June, 1942. The Battle of Coral Sea played a critical role in the Battle of Midway, not because Shokaku and Zuikaku were no longer present, but because Yorktown was. Time and time again, the Japanese believed they sank a different U.S. aircraft carrier, where in reality they were just attacking the same one that had not sunk any of the times they attacked it. The way we look at the battles of Coral Sea and Midway today are a little different from how the Japanese viewed it at the time, because even though they lost 4 carriers at Midway, they believed at that point in the war they had sank an equivalent number of U.S. aircraft carriers. By their count, 4 U.S. aircraft carriers had been sunk in the war, where in reality it had only been 2, and this would be misleading information for them in the future. With that having been said, there is nothing more I have to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.